Again, I'm Bill Hohenstein. I'm the director of USDA's Climate Change Program Office, and responsible for the issue of climate change within the department. We have 13 agencies within USDA that have some responsibility for climate change, whether it be through our conservation programs or research or managing portfolios that are at risk from climate change, such as our crop insurance program or our animal and health inspection service. So the issue of climate change cuts across USDA in very important ways, and we have a robust program both focused on mitigation and adaptation within the department. I do want to correct Jerry slightly. I wasn't at the climate negotiations for the entire 2 weeks, thankfully. I was there for the second week. We have a small team of negotiators within our Foreign Agricultural Service that were there for the entire time. And so I was there primarily to support them and to provide some input, but then also to participate in a number of offline meetings. I don't know how many of you have ever attended any of the climate change negotiations or followed them closely. It tends to be a three-ring circus, or at least a three-ring circus. There are multiple bodies under both the Framework Convention and under the Kyoto Protocol. There are ad hoc groups that form to negotiate specific issues. And then there is the entire engagement of civil society, which occurs through side events and meetings and sometimes demonstrations. And so it's a very robust and freewheeling process that can be highly effective, but can also get bogged down. And that's really, I think, the story coming out of these last 2 weeks of negotiations in Bonn. And things are stalled might not be the right word, but they're moving very slowly, and there are a number of significant issues coming out of the meeting in Durban that still need to be resolved in order to make progress. And so all of the discussions occurring on agriculture are sort of happening with this larger backdrop, and that has really shaped the discussions that we've been having on agriculture, and many of the issues and the positions that countries are taking are framed not so much about their concerns about agriculture, but their concerns about the larger process and where that's going. And so while it may appear to be dismal, from an agriculture perspective, I think there's a lot of hope for progress. So let me start by just describing where these negotiations are occurring and why they're occurring there. As I mentioned, there are a number of bodies within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there are two major agreements. The Framework Convention itself, which has a conference of the parties, a COP, that meets annually. Within the Framework Convention, you can actually pick up the document. There are articles that describe standing permanent bodies, which include the subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice and the subsidiary body on implementation, the SBI and the SUBSTA. And those groups meet twice a year. So they meet in usually May or June, and then they also meet on the margins of the annual COPs. In addition, the parties periodically have negotiated various ad hoc groups, or they've come to agreement on the creation of ad hoc groups to negotiate specific issues. For example, there was an ad hoc group that was created to create the Kyoto Protocol. And so the Berlin Mandate set in place a process to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol through an ad hoc group. And so, and in fact, in 2007, there was another set of ad hoc groups formed to negotiate both a second round of commitments under the Kyoto Protocol and an ad hoc group on long-term cooperative action, or the LCA. And within that ad hoc group under the LCA, there was a whole series of technical groups and negotiating groups that were formed, one on sectors, and agriculture was considered to be a sector. And so the discussions on agriculture really started after 2007 under this Bali Action Plan with the creation of this too many acronyms, body on long-term cooperative action, and a group on sectors. And that discussion was, the problem there was the agriculture issue was lumped in with a number of other issues that were very complicated, including how to treat international aviation bunker fuels. And so the overall progress on sectoral discussions within the LCA was almost non-existent, and agriculture was sort of caught up in that. One of the I don't know if you'd call it a crowning achievement, but one of the nice things that came out of the Durban meeting was that there was an agreement to take agriculture out of that rather unproductive group on sectors and to create a separate group within the subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice focused specifically on issues related to agriculture. And so these meetings in Bonn were the first meetings of this new group that was formed in Durban, in a new venue, in a venue that was focused on scientific and technical advice, not so much the thumb wrestling that can occur on how to structure new agreements or new ways forward. And so the U.S. was actually very happy about that. We thought that, primarily the issue of agriculture within the convention, there are a number of technical issues that need to be discussed, and that the Substa was actually a pretty good place to be having these discussions. And so with that as backdrop, what was the U.S. trying to achieve in these negotiations, at least when it came to agriculture? Well, I think first off, we recognize that agriculture is critically vulnerable to climate change. That I like to describe it as agriculture is on the receiving end of climate change, and that those vulnerabilities are not uniform, both across commodities but also regions, and countries have very different capacities in terms of their capability to adapt to climate change. And so it is critical that we discuss climate change adaptation. From the U.S. perspective, we have a pretty significant international agricultural development program, the Feed the Future initiative. We're very interested in integrating concerns about climate change into that program and looking for ways to cooperate with other countries on both food assistance and agricultural development assistance as it relates to climate change. I think we also recognize that agriculture contributes to climate change through the emissions of greenhouse gases and changes in carbon stocks. And so directly, agriculture is responsible for about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and as a driver of deforestation could be responsible for another, say, 10 to 15%. So by addressing land use, agriculture and forestry issues, you can address about a third of the overall contribution that humans make to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so not only is it really important to discuss mitigation in the context of agriculture, it's really difficult to solve the problem of climate change if you don't address the issues of the emissions that come from the land sector. So we believe it's important to talk about agriculture in the context of the convention and the bodies. We also recognize that there's an infrastructure in place to do that many of the issues that come up as they relate to agriculture are already being addressed in the negotiations. Issues related to adaptation. There's an entire agenda item, both in the LCA and in the Substa, to talk about adaptation. There's ample places to discuss mitigation, both in terms of commitments and then also the technical work and things like the transfer of technologies and capacity building. That there's discussions going on about finance, how to actually get all this work going. And finally, there are other related discussions like the discussion on reducing emissions from deforestation and land degradation. And those discussions also relate to agriculture. And so we went into this recognizing that we didn't necessarily need to discuss all things related to agriculture. There were, in fact, a number of venues where issues that were important to agriculture were already being discussed, and that the focus of these agricultural discussions should be to complement and to support these other agenda items. So what would we want to accomplish? Well, And I think that's actually important for this group to think about. What does it mean to actually talk about agriculture in the context of the Framework Convention, and what are you trying to accomplish through these negotiations? Well, from our perspective, we think we can highlight the benefits of taking action. And in fact, if you look at the RED discussions, the discussions on deforestation as an example, a lot of progress has been made in addressing deforestation, in part because of the spotlight that's been put on it in these international climate negotiations. And so, Brazil has made great progress in reducing its deforestation rate. Now, we wouldn't want to necessarily take credit for that due to the activities under the Framework Convention, but we can say that the focus on deforestation has made it easier for countries to take action and to think about what their options are in taking action. And so just highlighting the importance of the sector is important in having these discussions. There are a lot of technical complexities in terms of dealing with both mitigation and adaptation in the agricultural sector. And so what we found is within the discussions on finance and adaptation and tech transfer, there doesn't seem to be much of a focus on agriculture, in part because of these technical complexities and the fact that the agricultural discussions or the agricultural issue has a different group of experts than typically is involved in some of these other discussions. We think that discussions could be useful in terms of identifying priorities. We know that there are different efforts like the CAADP plans within Africa that are trying to prioritize what needs to be done, both in terms of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change. We think they can be brought forward. And then finally, it was maybe our naive thinking, but maybe not too naive, thinking that by making some progress on agriculture, it would be a way of demonstrating that the convention process works, that we can actually make progress on some of these larger issues. And so with that in mind, we made our first submission back in March to the UN on what we would like to see moving forward on the ag discussions. And it's a fairly simple document. It talks about the benefits of having these discussions in the SBSTA, which is the technical body, the fact that we can focus on things like assessing the state of the science. We can hear from groups like the IPCC. We can examine the adequacy of current information and data. We can assess the effectiveness of specific mitigation technologies and practices and do the same on the adaptation side. We can provide guidance to other groups that are working on things like technical transfer or technology transfer and capacity building. And we can also identify research needs and research gaps that could be given back to the countries to work on or to groups like the IPCC. And so that was at the heart of our submission, that the SBSTA was actually a very good place to be having these discussions on agriculture. And we felt very comfortable in starting those discussions on the issue of adaptation. We realize that that is a top priority of many developing countries. It's a top priority for us. We think that it's an important place to start. And so we proposed that we would hold a technical workshop on agricultural adaptation sometime between this May meeting and the next COP, which is happening in Doha, and that the SBSTA mandate, all of these technical issues, would drive the scope of that workshop. And then we said next year we should focus on mitigation and have a similar process, but focusing on the issues surrounding mitigation. And so in some ways that would define a program of work. So that was our hope going into this meeting, that we could agree at least on a fairly straightforward process forward, focused on technical issues with some technical input in a workshop, hopefully with input from groups like the IPCC and FAO and IFPRI. That didn't happen in Bonn. In fact, where we ended up, it was with a two-line decision, which was essentially that we discussed issues related to agriculture, and we will continue those discussions at our next meeting. And so if you think about it in golf terms, it was like a mulligan. Where a mulligan is, you tee up the ball and you hit it into the woods, and everyone agrees that, well, that didn't really count. We're just going to tee it up again next time and hopefully have a better outcome. And so that's more or less what we succeeded in doing, although I think we have a better understanding of where the countries are now than we did maybe 6 months ago. Now, what's hanging up these discussions, and why couldn't we get agreement on
simple things like a workshop on adaptation. Well, again, and this is where the ag discussions are happening in the broader context. There was also an agreement in Durban to begin discussions on a new agreement under this Durban platform. And this new agreement doesn't make the same historic distinctions that we've had within the Framework Convention on the responsibilities of developed countries and developing countries. And in fact, it talks about responsibilities for all countries. And there was a lot of concern among the developing countries, and some in particular, about what that meant. And in fact, there was a lot of reluctance to begin discussions on that. And that concern about, in particular, mitigation responsibilities, mitigation actions, sort of was kind of played out not just within the discussions under the Durban platform, but in all of the discussions we were having. And so there was no interest in even mentioning the word mitigation or talking about mitigation in our technical agriculture discussions. Now, we could live with that as long as there was a process moving forward that was going to continue to keep all these issues on the table. And in the end, we could agree to simply having a discussion about adaptation sometime now and between now and the next meeting in Doha. The other issue that was thrown on the table is a need to reference particular principles of the convention, and in particular a principle dealing with common but differentiated responsibilities, which is part of a phrase that's included in the Framework Convention. The full phrase is actually common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And so it's an important principle within the Framework Convention, but as many useful texts, there's a lot of interpretation that can go on in terms of what that means. And the interpretations are quite different among countries. From our perspective, while it's a useful principle under the convention, there are many useful principles under the convention, and we didn't see a need to reference CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, in the context of a SBSTA conclusion, which was primarily focused on scientific and technical advice. And so we had a problem with that. And in the end, it was that language that really caused the ultimate lack of a compromise on or consensus on moving forward. So we will continue to have these discussions, and I do want to say that while it doesn't appear that we made much progress, things aren't as bad as it looks. I think there was a whole lot of interest in making progress on agriculture and having these discussions among countries. It got caught up in the larger process, and so to the extent that countries can make progress under the Durban platform, I think the issues of agriculture will begin to move forward. I think in the interim, there's going to clearly be a need to move forward outside the convention process. And that means moving forward bilaterally with countries that are interested in working with us, moving forward through the Feed the Future initiative, moving forward with groups like, there's a group called the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases that is a consortium of countries working on mitigation technologies and practices. I think as well, it's really important for us, and by us I mean the broad us, not just the U.S. government, but the NGOs, civil society, to define what success would be in SBSTA and what we're trying to accomplish by having specific discussions on agriculture under the Framework Convention, given that agriculture is implicitly included in a number of other discussions. And then finally, just an observation about the mitigation discussion, and some of it was driven by concerns about the Durban platform and the pending discussions about future commitments and obligations. But some of it was also driven by some of the LDCs, the least developed countries, and concerns about, in particular, carbon markets. And they saw mitigation as being synonymous with carbon markets. And there's a little bit of apprehension on applying carbon markets to agriculture, primarily because it could divert resources from adaptation. There's a lot of questions as to how big the benefits are, and that I think what some countries are seeing is that there's a lot of emphasis on measurement and monitoring these mitigation projects, and it's taking up a lot of resources. And so even within the discussions on mitigation, part of it's driven by some of the countries like China and India and Brazil that are concerned about, what exactly are they getting into, but then some of it is also being driven by some of the LDCs that really want to focus on adaptation more than mitigation, at least for the time being. And so why don't I stop there? I know David's probably going to have some thoughts on all this and maybe thoughts on how this connects potentially to Rio. And then we could probably stop and take questions. Dave.